A report takes 6 months to write, and if it is wrong in the way this one was wrong, exactly 40 seconds to become worthless. That was how long it took the analytics division of the cognate assembly to read the summary line, cross-reference it against a single anomaly log, and stamp the word disputed across 400 pages of what had, until that moment, been considered the most thorough first contact assessment filed in 11 years. No one in the Assembly's long history of absorbing other species into its sphere had ever seen that stamp applied to an ambassadorial report before. Reports from the Van Cognate were not opinions. They were structural findings, built the way engineers built load-bearing beams, tested, cross-referenced, certified against 3 centuries of protocol, and the behavioral data of 147 previously catalogued civilizations. When a cognate ambassador wrote that a species was fractured, primitive, or strategically negligible, that sentence became the foundation on which fleets moved, treaties were signed, and the borders of known space were quietly redrawn. The galaxy did not, as a rule, argue with a cognate finding. It was arguing with this one. The 8 billion people of a small gray-blue world in a system the cognate's own charts still labeled. Out of 80 years of institutional habit. Designation Sol, Tier 4, no action required, had just become the first subject in cognate history whose assessment had been overturned before the fleet even finished drafting its integration timetable. And the woman whose name sat at the top of that report, whose signature, whose 80 years of unblemished service, whose entire professional identity had been built on the unglamorous, essential work of telling the Assembly the truth about what it was about to walk into, was, at the exact moment the red stamp appeared on her screen, standing in her quarters aboard a cognate cruiser 3 light years from the world she had just spent 6 months failing to understand. Her name was Threll Onves, and she had filed 11,000 reports in a career built on never once being wrong. This was going to be the report that ended that record, and she did not yet know, could not yet know, standing there with the red stamp glowing on her screen and her claws beginning, for the first time in 80 years, to tremble, that the ending of her record and the survival of her species' entire integration strategy were about to become the same problem. She had spent those 6 months embedded in what the humans called their United Nations headquarters, a squat gray building on the edge of a gray river in a city they had named, with what she'd characterized in her notes as a charming lack of imagination, New York. She had watched them argue in echoing marble chambers over fishing quotas and carbon targets, and the exact wording of resolutions that would be diluted into meaninglessness before they were ever voted on. She had watched delegations walk out of sessions in performative fury, watched news broadcasts fracture into 100 competing narratives that seemed to agree on nothing except that agreement itself was suspicious, watched a species that could not settle on a shared calendar system attempt, in the 18 months since first contact, to coordinate a unified species-wide response to the knowledge that they were not alone in the universe, and fail, publicly, repeatedly, for most of that time. Her report had been thorough in the way only a cognate report could be thorough. Population, 8 billion fractured across 193 sovereign states, none of which fully trusted the others, several of which had fought each other directly within living memory. Military coordination, non-existent above the level of loose, historically unstable alliances. Technology, adequate for travel within their own solar system, centuries behind cognate standards in fold propulsion, directed energy and shielding. Psychological profile, reactive, fragmented, prone to internal conflict, incapable of the sustained strategic patience that had let the cognate absorb 11 other species into its sphere across 400 years without fighting a single major war. Her conclusion, stated in the summary line every analyst in the assembly would read first, was 6 words long. Earth presents no meaningful resistance capacity. She remembered, with unusual clarity for a memory she had not revisited in months, one specific afternoon session that she had cited 3 times in her original report as representative of the human governance model as a whole. It concerned a proposed resolution on the allocation of orbital debris cleanup responsibilities, a matter so technical and so far removed from any question of planetary defense that Threll had attended largely as a formality, expecting to observe 20 minutes of procedural housekeeping before moving on to matters she considered more strategy. Call irrelevant. Instead, she had watched the session run for 6 hours. A delegation from an island nation whose entire landmass sat barely above sea level had argued, with what Threll's translation matrix rendered as considerable and increasingly personal frustration, that larger spacefaring nations bore disproportionate responsibility for a problem their own launch programs had created, while a delegate from one of those larger nations had countered, in language so carefully hedged it took Threll several minutes to determine he was disagreeing at all. That historical responsibility was an inappropriate basis for forward-looking policy. A third delegation had proposed a compromise formula so mathematically intricate that 2 full hours were consumed simply debating whether the formula's variables had been correctly defined. By the time the session adjourned without a vote, having accomplished nothing that Threll's notes could identify as concrete progress, she had filed the entire afternoon under a heading she now, months later, found almost unbearable to reread. Representative example, institutional paralysis, low strategic relevance. What she had not recorded, because she had not thought to look for it, was what happened in the final 10 minutes after the gavel fell and the cameras that broadcast the session to the wider human public switched off. She remembered it now only because Daniel Ockhafer had been present that day, standing near the chamber's rear exit in his unremarkable advisory capacity. And she remembered, without having thought about it again until this moment, that 3 of the delegates who had spent 6 hours in open, occasionally bitter disagreement had walked out together afterward, speaking quietly among themselves in a tone entirely unlike the one they had used on the record, and that Daniel Ockhafer had fallen into step beside them without any of the 4 appearing to find this remarkable at all. She had noted his presence at the time only as an administrative curiosity. She understood now that she had been watching, without recognizing it, the actual mechanism by which decisions on this world were made. Not the 6 hours of theater conducted for cameras and constituents, but the 10 unrecorded minutes afterward, in a hallway, among people who had just finished performing an argument they did not fully feel, before turning to discuss, in private, whatever it was they had actually agreed to feel. She had believed it was an unremarkable finding, a useful one, the kind of clean, decisive assessment that let the integration process proceed efficiently, without wasting fleet resources garrisoning a world that would understand, the moment its leadership grasped the true shape of the alternative, that surrender was simply the intelligent choice. The annotation beneath the red stamp was 3 lines long, and it had not been written by a junior policy officer looking to make a name for herself. It had been written by an intelligence director named Kess Overin, whose findings had preceded 4 of the cognate's most successful integration campaigns, and who did not, as a professional matter of record, write annotations for reports that were merely mistaken. Kess Overin wrote annotations for reports that were dangerous. Sensor telemetry from the outer relay stations does not correlate with Ambassador Onves's assessment. It read, "Recommend independent verification before integration protocol proceeds. See attached anomaly log." Threll opened the log with the particular, specific unease of a person who has just been told, calmly and in writing, that the ground she has spent 6 months standing on was never load-bearing in the first place. The log was 14 pages, and by the third page her hands, 4 slender digits each, capable of the fine manipulation that had let generations of van engineers build some of the most elegant diplomatic instruments in known space, had begun, for the first time in 80 years of service, to shake. The first entry was small enough that she almost dismissed it before finishing the paragraph. A cognate scout drone, cataloging debris in the asteroid belt between Earth's 4th and 5th planets, had gone dark 11 months earlier. Standard procedure logged the loss as mechanical failure, the kind of unremarkable attrition scout drones suffered constantly in fields thick with micrometeorites and radiation noise. Nothing in Threll's report had flagged it, because nothing about one dead drone in a busy asteroid field should have mattered to anyone. Except the drone had not failed. In the final 400 milliseconds before its signal ceased, it had transmitted a burst of raw telemetry that sat unread in an archive for the better part of a year, until Kess Overend's division ran it through a threat pattern analysis 6 weeks before this briefing. The telemetry showed the drone's sensors registering an object, small, fast, radiating no drive signature, no thermal bloom. Nothing a cognate scout's instrumentation should have been capable of missing, closing the distance to the drone in a way that broke the drone's own targeting mathematics. The object had not been present. Then it had been 300 kilometers distant. Then it had been beside the drone. The intervening space showed no trace of transit at all, as though the object had simply stopped existing in one location and resumed existing in another. And the drone's sensors, built by engineers who had never needed to account for that possibility, had simply logged the gap as instrument error and gone dark a moment later. The second entry involved a cognate listening post positioned at the edge of the system, the very post that had fed Threll the raw broadcast data she'd used to characterize Earth's fractured, quarrelsome communications culture, the endless committee arguments, the contradictory news cycles, all of it. 8 months earlier, the post's logs showed a 41-second gap. Not static, not background noise. A clean, total, surgical absence of data, followed by a resumption exactly where the recording should have continued, as though nothing whatsoever had happened in between. The standard explanation was equipment malfunction. Kess Overend's division had run a diagnostic on an identical unit back in cognate space, and found that producing a gap that clean, that precisely bounded, without triggering a single corresponding fault log, required either an engineering capability the cognate itself did not possess, or the deliberate intervention of something that understood the listening post's firmware more intimately than the engineers who had built it. The third entry was the one that made Threll set the log down and stand very still in the center of her quarters, listening to the recycled air hiss through the vents, for almost a full minute before she trusted herself to keep reading. 6 weeks earlier, a cognate logistics vessel, unarmed, registered, broadcasting the diplomatic transponder code every species in the integration protocol was contractually required to honor, had taken a routine supply run through a stretch of space its charts listed as empty, 4 light hours from Earth, well outside any zone Threll's report had described as monitored, patrolled, or in any way significant. The vessel's automated systems logged a proximity alert 11 seconds before a craft of unknown origin passed within 200 meters of the logistics vessel's hull, at a velocity the ship's own instruments described, with what Threll now recognized as simple mechanical bewilderment, as not applicable, recalculate. The craft had not fired, had not communicated, had not, as far as any sensor aboard the logistics vessel could determine, done anything at all except exist, briefly, close enough to touch, and then cease to exist in any location the ship's instruments could subsequently find. Threll read the description of that craft's hull markings 3 times before she believed it. According to every optical sensor aboard the logistics vessel, the hull had absorbed light rather than reflecting it, a materials problem Kess Overend's team had flagged in the margins with 4 separate exclamation points, an editorial breach so unlike the flat, affectless prose of cognate analytical writing that Threll understood, reading it, exactly how frightened the analyst writing those margins must have been. Stenciled along that light-swallowing hull in human characters was a single word. "A patience." Threll sat down on the edge of her bunk and stayed there for a long time. She thought about the 6 months she had spent in that gray building by the gray river, watching humans shout at each other about carbon quotas and border disputes, and whose fishing fleet had drifted into whose territorial waters. And she had read all of it, correctly. She still believed, as raw data, as evidence of a fractured, undisciplined civilization incapable of coordinated defense. What she had never once done, in 6 months of watching, was ask herself whether the arguing in that gray building had ever been the whole picture, whether it had been designed, from the beginning, not to be. She thought about a line from her own report, one she had included almost as color commentary rather than strategic analysis, a small human quirk she'd found charming enough to note but not significant enough to weigh. Humans, she had written, possess an unusual cultural relationship with restraint. Multiple interview subjects described a national ethos built around not escalating, waiting for provocation to exhaust itself, preferring the quiet response to the loud one. At the time, she had filed that observation under behavioral color, notable but non-strategic, in the same section where she'd noted their peculiar fondness for a form of humor they called understatement. She had called it a personality trait. She had never once asked what it might look like when an entire civil is at. Ian decided to make that trait into doctrine. She made herself go back further, to the beginning, to a memory she had not revisited since drafting the original report, because at the time it had seemed like nothing more than an administrative footnote. She remembered the day the first contact broadcast had actually gone out, not the human response to it, which she had studied exhaustively, but the broadcast itself, the one the cognate had sent, polite and procedural and utterly standard, the same message that had opened negotiations with all 11 prior species. "Greetings. We have observed your civilization from a respectful distance for the standard evaluation period. We extend an invitation to formal contact and eventual integration into a governance framework that has brought stability and prosperity to 147 worlds. A representative will arrive within the human calendar year to begin the assessment process." She had watched, from aboard the very first cognate vessel to make contact, the initial human reaction unfold across every monitored channel simultaneously, and she remembered thinking, at the time, that what she was watching was chaos. Within 6 hours, 3 different national governments had issued 3 contradictory public statements. Within 12, a rumor that the broadcast was a hoax, a hostile hack, or a natural phenomenon misidentified by nervous instruments had gained enough traction on human information networks that it briefly outpaced the actual story. Within a day, at least 4 separate military commands across 4 separate nations had, according to the open-source reporting she'd gathered at the time, raised their alert postures independently, without any indication of coordination between them, each one apparently acting on its own reading of the same ambiguous 30-second message. She had written in her earliest field notes that this was diagnostic. A unified species facing unprecedented contact would speak with one voice within hours. Humanity took 11 days to produce anything resembling an official joint statement, and even that statement, when it finally arrived, was hedged, qualified, and immediately criticized by several of the same governments that had supposedly agreed to it. She had not, at the time, thought to ask what those 4 independent military commands had actually done in the 11 days between the broadcast and the joint statement. She had assumed, because every precedent in cognate contact history told her to assume it, that the answer was nothing coordinated, nothing significant, nothing beyond the ordinary reflexive posturing of frightened, disorganized governments. She had not asked, because in 80 years of service across 11 prior first contacts, the answer to that question had never once been anything else. She understood now, sitting in her quarters with the anomaly log open beside her, that she had simply never before been the ambassador assigned to the one species where the answer might be different, and that the 11 days of apparent chaos following first contact were, in retrospect, exactly the length of time it would take 4 separately governed militaries to quietly agree, through channels that left no public record at all, on precisely how much of their true capability they intended to show a visiting cognate ambassador, and how much they intended to keep entirely off the books. The Assembly convened an emergency session 4 days later, and for the first time in her career, Threll Onves was not the one standing at the podium presenting findings. She sat instead in the observation gallery, high above the chamber floor, and watched Kes Overin take the podium where Threll herself had stood 11,000 times, and listened to a briefing that dismantled, point by careful point, everything the cognate believed it understood about the 3rd planet from a small yellow star. "The pattern," Kes Overin said, and her voice through the chamber's amplification system carried none of the crisp, settled confidence Threll remembered from her own campaign briefings years before, "is not one of weakness observed. It is one of weakness performed. We have cross-referenced 41 comparable anomalies across the last 3 standard years, every one of them within 4 light hours of Earth, every one involving craft, personnel, or signal activity that human civilian and even human military channels show absolutely no record of. Not classified record. No record at all. As though whatever is producing these anomalies does not officially exist within the command structure Ambassador Onves's report cataloged so thoroughly. A delegate from the shipping guild, an older man, silver-plumed, whose family had sat on the assembly for 6 generations, rose from his seat 2 rows below Threll and asked the question she herself had not yet been able to make her own mouth form. "Are you suggesting Earth maintains a second military, concealed even from its own civilian government?" "I am suggesting," Kes Overin said without hurry, "that we do not yet know what we are looking at, and that an ambassadorial report telling this assembly we understand Earth well enough to recommend a Tier 3 integration with minimal military presence was built on an assumption this assembly has never before had cause to question, that the loudest, most visible, most chaotic parts of a civilization are also its most representative parts. I would ask this assembly to sit for a moment with how badly that assumption has served every prior integration where it went unexamined, and with the fact that in every one of those cases, the civilization in question was less capable of hiding its true shape from us than this one appears to be. A second delegate rose before Kess Overin could continue, a younger member of the Military Oversight Committee, someone Threll did not recognize, his plumage still bearing the unweathered brightness of a recent appointment. With respect to the director's findings, 41 anomalies across 3 years, spread across an entire system, could as easily represent instrument error accumulating across an aging relay network as they could represent a hidden military capability. This assembly has disputed ambassadorial reports on thinner evidence than this, and been wrong to do so. I would ask the director what confidence interval her division is prepared to defend, formally, on the record, before this assembly discards 6 months of a decorated ambassador's fieldwork. A fair question, Kess Overin said, and Threll, watching from the gallery, thought she heard something almost like relief in the director's voice, the relief of a professional being asked to show her work rather than simply being believed. My division is not asking this assembly to conclude that Earth possesses a concealed fleet. We are asking this assembly to conclude that we cannot currently rule it out, and that the cost of being wrong in that direction is categorically different from the cost of being wrong in the other. If Ambassador Onves's original assessment is correct, and we proceed cautiously regardless, we lose time and some administrative efficiency. If the anomaly pattern is correct, and we proceed on the ambassador's original recommendation regardless, we lose ships, personnel, and quite possibly the confidence of every other species watching how this assembly conducts itself. I am not asking this chamber to be certain. I am asking this chamber to be appropriately uncertain, which is a state Ambassador Onves's report did not leave room for. The younger delegate did not immediately sit down. And if the director is wrong, if this becomes the precedent by which any future ambassador's report can be overturned on the strength of 41 unexplained censor readings, what does that do to the credibility of the entire ambassadorial corps? It was Threll herself who answered, though she had not planned to speak, rising from her seat in the gallery with a suddenness that drew every eye in the chamber upward toward her. "It does to the ambassadorial corps," she said, into a silence so complete she could hear the recycled air moving through the vents above her. "Precisely what it should do. It reminds every ambassador who comes after me that confidence is not the same instrument as accuracy, and that a report which cannot be disputed by its own author, honestly, in light of new evidence, was never actually a report. It was a habit wearing a report's clothing. I would rather be the ambassador remembered for being wrong and saying so than the one remembered for being confident and silent, while this assembly moved fleets on my word alone." No one spoke for a long moment after that. The younger delegate sat down without further comment, and Kess Overin, still at the podium, allowed the silence to stretch a beat longer than protocol strictly required before continuing. Threll sat with it. She sat with it through the rest of the session, and through 3 sleepless nights afterward in her quarters, replaying every dismissive line of her own report, and hearing it now not as analysis, but as exactly the kind of institutional overconfidence that got scout drones silently disassembled and diplomatic vessels quietly, courteously, terrifyingly buzzed by something that left a single word stenciled into a hull that ate light. The assembly did not vote to abandon integration outright. The cognate did not abandon anything. That had never been the culture that absorbed 11 species across 4 centuries without a major war. But it voted, unanimously and without debate, a unanimity Threll had never once witnessed on any matter in 80 years of service, to suspend her Tier 3 recommendation, to redesignate Earth's status from no action required to pending full reassessment, and in the vote that landed in her sternum like a physical blow, to recall her from the AMBA. Essadorial posting she had held for 6 months and reassigned the entire file to a joint intelligence diplomatic team, which would, the resolution specified in language stripped of every diplomatic softener the Assembly usually reached for, file preliminary findings within 60 days rather than the standard 2-year first contact window. 60 days, for a species she herself had needed 6 full months merely to conclude, was fractious and unthreatening. The Assembly was afraid. Threll understood this, watching the vote tally scroll across the chamber's display in silent, unanimous green, and she understood too, with a clarity that felt less like insight than like grief. That fear was the correct response, that she had spent 6 months on that gray-blue world without once feeling it, and that this absence, this serene, professional, entirely credentialed failure to be afraid of anything about Earth, was the actual defect in her report, not any single wrong data point. The tone underneath all of them. She requested and was granted one final visit to the Earth posting before her formal reassignment took effect, not to revise her report, which was beyond revision now, filed and disputed and archived as a cautionary case study that junior analysts would study for decades, but because something in her, some instinct 80 years of cognate training had never quite managed to fully domesticate, needed to stand once more in that gray city and look at it with eyes that had finally, belatedly, learned what to look for. She arrived at the tail end of what humans called autumn, and the river was the same flat pewter color it had been 6 months before, and the great gray building on its bank looked, from the outside, exactly as it always had. A squat, unglamorous monument to a species that could apparently not agree on anything, gathered under one roof to prove it, week after week, in front of cameras that broadcast every disagreement to 8 billion people who mostly, according to every survey Threll had studied, found the whole spectacle faintly embarrassing. Inside, nothing had changed either, at least not on the surface. Committees deadlocked over the same disputes they'd been deadlocked over in the spring. A regional argument over water rights on a continent she'd visited only once dominated 3 consecutive news cycles, while an actual armed skirmish between 2 much smaller nations, half a world away, received a single evening's coverage before it was buried beneath celebrity gossip and sports scores. Delegates walked out of sessions. A junior minister from a mid-sized coastal nation was caught, on an open microphone, describing a rival delegation's negotiating position in terms that would have ended a cognate diplomatic career on the spot. And the resulting scandal occupied 4 full days of coverage on every human channel Threll's translation matrix could parse. It looked on the surface exactly like the civilization she had described in 400 pages 6 months earlier. Loud, fractured, reactive, entirely comfortingly familiar. She spent 4 days simply watching, differently this time, not for what the humans said in their echoing marble chambers, but for what they conspicuously did not say, for the silences that fell in specific places and specific ways, for the questions journalists asked that were answered with practiced, well-rehearsed vagueness by officials who did not seem remotely troubled by giving vague answers, which was itself, she began to realize, a kind of information she had never thought to collect. A species that improvised its evasions sounded different from a species that had rehearsed them. She had spent 6 months listening to humans and had never once asked which kind of silence she was hearing. On the 5th day, she requested, through channels she noted, with some private and not entirely comfortable irony, were considerably harder to navigate than they had been during her original posting. A private meeting with the human liaison who had shadowed her original embassy. His name was Daniel Ockaffer, and he held a title so deliberately unremarkable, Senior Advisor, Interagency Coordination. That Threll, in her original report, had characterized him in a single dismissive clause as a mid-level bureaucrat of no particular strategic significance. She had in 6 months spoken with him perhaps a dozen times, always about logistics, always about scheduling, always about the small, forgettable administrative machinery that keeps an embassy running. She had never once, reading back over her own notes now, asked herself why the same unremarkable man kept appearing in the room every time something genuinely sensitive was being discussed. He met her in a small, windowless room on a floor of the building her original security clearance, she now understood, had never actually granted her access to. He had aged, in the human sense, only a handful of days since she'd last seen him. Ed, in some other sense, she did not have a precise category for, considerably older than that. "You read the anomaly reports," he said, once the door had sealed behind her and the room's ambient hum indicated whatever privacy measures the humans used had engaged. It was not offered as a question. Threll found herself, against 80 years of careful diplomatic conditioning, simply telling him the truth, because the truth was the only currency she had left that felt worth spending. "I read them. I would like to understand what I failed to see the first time I sat across from you." Daniel Ockaffer was quiet for a long moment, turning something over, a stylus, a small physical habit she remembered from their earlier meetings, the human equivalent, she supposed, of the way van diplomats sometimes flexed their claws when composing a difficult answer. "You saw a species arguing about fishing rights and carbon quotas and water access, and you concluded we couldn't organize a coordinated response to a real threat. You weren't wrong about the arguing, Ambassador. People here really do fight about all of that constantly, and it costs us things. I won't pretend otherwise, not to you, not after everything. You were wrong about what the arguing was for." "Explain that to me," Threll said. "Plainly. I no longer have the patience for careful phrasing, and I suspect you know that already." Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, something more like recognition. "Every species you've integrated learned to fear you slowly over generations, watching your fleets grow at the edges of your territory, calibrating a response to a threat that arrived incrementally, giving them time to adjust their whole culture around the fact of you. We didn't get that runway. We got a broadcast 18 months ago, informing us politely by your own assembly's account that our species would be evaluated for integration into a governance structure we'd had no vote in creating and no say in designing. We had 18 months to decide, as a fractured, quarrelsome, historically self-destructive species, whether we agreed with that premise at all. Your leadership never discussed integration in any session I monitored," Threll said. "I reviewed every public broadcast. I built cross-reference timelines of every committee session on the subject. There is no gap in my record." "There's no gap in the record you had access to," Daniel Ockaffer said, and there was no cruelty in the correction, only a kind of tired precision. "The arguing you watched for 6 months, Ambassador, the fishing disputes, the water rights, the committee that spent 4 sessions unable to agree on a shared calendar reform, that wasn't the absence of coordination. It was the visible layer sitting on top of it. We have spent most of our recorded history unable to agree on almost anything, and that history is real. I won't insult either of us by pretending it isn't. But we have also spent that same history discovering, over and over, region by region, catastrophe by catastrophe, exactly how quickly a fractured species can become a coordinated one, the moment something external makes unity the only alternative to extinction. You didn't watch us fail to organize, Ambassador. You watched us organize somewhere your instruments weren't pointed, because we have had, across roughly 11,000 years of extremely ugly practice, a great deal of experience doing precisely that without asking anyone's permission first. Threll thought of the word stenciled on a hull that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. The vessel that approached our logistics ship, the one with the markings, was that intended as a message to this assembly? For the first time in the conversation, something crossed Daniel Ockhafer's face that might have been the distant ancestor of a smile, though her translation matrix flagged no accompanying warmth to parse. If it had been a message, Ambassador, you'd have received it clearly, and there would be no ambiguity in your assembly's briefing room right now about what it meant. What you got instead, as I understand it, and I want to be precise, because precision matters here, was a mistake. A training exercise came closer to a registered civilian vessel than protocol allows, and there was a great deal of very unhappy paperwork generated on our end afterward, none of which I'm authorized to discuss with you in any detail. I would gently caution your assembly against reading deliberate intention into every anomaly in that log. Some of what you're seeing isn't theater. It's simply what a species that got badly frightened 18 months ago has spent that time quietly, unglamorously, without press coverage, building the same thing every other species in your integration protocol eventually built, except we built it without informing you where, or how much, or how fast. And the drone, the one that transmitted its final telemetry and then went dar. Okay, I don't have clearance to discuss active assets, Ambassador. He said it without hesitation and without apology, the way one might decline to discuss a family matter with a stranger who had, until recently, been cataloging that family for a foreign government. And Threll understood that this flat, unadorned refusal told her more than any classified briefing could have. She let the silence sit between them for a while, listening to the building's ambient hum, and then she asked the question she had actually crossed 4 light years to ask, the one underneath every anomaly in the log and every unanimous vote in the chamber. Was I wrong, she said, about the weakness? Daniel Ockhafer considered the question with what Threll recognized, even across the imperfections of her translation matrix, as genuine care, not the performed, calibrated care of diplomacy, which she had spent 80 years learning to produce on demand, but the plainer, costlier kind, the kind that requires the speaker to actually sit inside the discomfort of the answer before giving it. You were right about a great deal, Ambassador. We are fractured. We fight amongst ourselves more than almost any other measure your assembly uses would predict of a species that survived long enough to reach the stars, and it has cost us more than I think you'll ever find a clean number for in any file. We are, by nearly every metric your civilization tracks, younger and smaller and less internally coordinated than the cognate. If you'd asked me honestly 18 months ago whether we could survive sustained contact with a civilization built the way yours is built, I'm not certain I could have told you yes with a straight face. He paused, and the pause carried weight. But you filed a report that told this assembly we present no meaningful resistance capacity, and I think what you actually meant, without realizing it, was that we present no resistance capacity you were equipped to see. Those are not the same finding, Ambassador, and the distance between them is the only reason this assembly of yours is holding emergency sessions instead of quietly moving fleets. What would you have me tell them, Threll asked, when I file my final assessment? Tell them the truth, Daniel HFY said. Tell them we are exactly as divided and difficult and slow to agree on almost anything as your original report said, because that part was accurate, and it will remain accurate for a very long time. And tell them that a species which has spent its entire history learning how to survive itself has, by the time anything else came looking, already had a great deal of practice surviving something else too. Tell them the arguing was never the whole picture. It was never meant to be. Threll left that windowless room with more questions than she had entered with. And in the days that followed, before her formal reassignment took effect, she used the last of her fading credentials to pursue 3 of them, because 80 years of training had left her constitutionally incapable of walking away from an unfinished inquiry, even one that terrified her. The first question took her to a public archive, open to any accredited diplomatic staff, containing declassified military histories that every human school child, she was told, studied as a matter of course. She had skimmed these histories during her original posting and dismissed them as color, the kind of martial folklore every species accumulated and mythologized, useful for understanding cultural self-image, but strategically negligible. She read them again now with different eyes, and this time she did not skim. She read about a period in the previous century when the humans had split themselves into 2 vast, opposing coalitions, each one capable, by the end of that period, of ending organized life across their entire home world several times over, and had spent nearly half a century in a state of maximum mutual threat without ever actually doing so, restrained not by any external authority, but by an intricate, self-imposed architecture of signaling, deterrence, and again and again in the historical record, moments where individual humans in positions of enormous consequence chose, at real personal risk, not to escalate a crisis that every instrument in front of them said they should. She read about a single junior officer aboard a submarine, during a standoff so tense that 3 men needed to agree unanimously before a launch order could proceed, who alone refused his agreement, and about how that refusal, undocumented, unrewarded, unknown to the wider public for decades afterward, was now taught in cognate military academies that had absorbed the file only after Kess Overin's team flagged it. As one of the single most consequential acts of individual restraint in the recorded history of any spacefaring species, human or otherwise. She had read a summary of this history in her original research. She had filed it under Cultural Resilience, Near Catastrophe Avoided, of interest to sociological analysts. She had never once asked herself what it meant that an entire civilization had built, apparently by instinct and necessity rather than design, a working cultural muscle for holding catastrophic capability in reserve, indefinitely without using it, for the better part of a century. Because that was, she now understood with a coldness that settled somewhere beneath her sternum. Precisely the muscle the cognate itself relied on to hold its own fleets in check across 400 years of integration. She had been looking at a mirror the entire time and had described it in her report as a crack in the glass. The second question took her, with considerably more difficulty and the quiet intervention of Daniel HFY, who arranged the access without ever explaining exactly how, to a briefing with a human officer whose actual rank and department were never disclosed to her, in a facility whose location she was asked, and agreed never to record. The officer was younger than Threll had expected, unhurried in her manner, and she answered exactly as many questions as she chose to and declined the rest without apology or elaboration. "Your ambassador's report," the officer said, early in the conversation, Wasn't wrong that we can't get 193 governments to agree on a shared response to first contact. It was wrong that agreement was ever the plan. Then what was the plan? Thrill asked. Redundancy, the officer said. You come from a civilization that moves as one body ambassador, one command structure, one strategic doctrine, one fleet, extraordinarily efficient, extraordinarily coordinated, and forgive me, because I mean this as an observation rather than an insult, extraordinarily easy to understand completely, once someone has studied it long enough. You spent 6 months studying us the same way, looking for the one command structure, the one doctrine, the one fleet, and you didn't find it, because it doesn't exist. What exists instead is 193 governments that agree on almost nothing in public and maintain, in private, an overlapping, deliberately redundant lattice of capabilities that no single failure, no single betrayal, no single first strike against any one node could take down all at once. We built it that way on purpose, Ambassador, because we spent most of the 20th century learning, at appalling cost, what happens to a species that puts all its capability in one place and lets one bad decision or one successful attack take the whole thing out. You didn't find our coordination because you were looking for a single structure. We don't have one. We have 193 of them, and most of what you watched us argue about in that gray building was never really about fishing rights. It was the visible, permissible layer of an argument about how much any one of those 193 governments should be allowed to know about what the others were quietly doing underneath. Then the anomalies in the log, Threll said. They are not one program, they are many uncoordinated, each nation's own quiet response. Some of them, the officer said. Not all. I'm not going to tell you which is which, Ambassador, and I'd be lying if I told you I knew the full shape of it myself. That's rather the point. No single person in this building, in this government, on this planet, has the complete picture of what your assembly is actually facing, because we built it specifically so that no single point of failure, including an ambassador with very good instincts and 80 years of training, could ever assemble that picture from the outside in 6 months. You got the arguing. You got the fishing quotas. You got the committee that couldn't agree on a calendar. That was never a failure of our species to hide, Ambassador. It was the design working exactly as intended. Your ambassador's report noted our lack of a unified command structure as a strategic vulnerability, Threll said. I would ask you directly whether that assessment was accurate. The officer considered the question longer than she had considered any previous one. It's accurate in the sense that matters to a diplomat trying to negotiate a single binding treaty with us, Ambassador. There is no one person, no one government, no one office who can sign a document on behalf of this entire species and have it mean what your assembly would want it to mean. That's real, and it will make integration slower and messier than it was with any species you've absorbed before, if it happens at all. It's inaccurate in the sense that matters to a fleet commander evaluating whether we can mount a coordinated defense, because coordination and unification are not the same thing, and we learned the difference between them the hard way, more than once, before your assembly ever knew we existed. Explain the distinction, 3. L said. A unified command structure gives you one point of failure and one point of control, the officer said. You disable the one command, you disable the whole force. That's how your fleets are built, and it's efficient right up until someone finds the single thread to pull. We don't have a single thread. We have 193 governments, several hundred distinct military traditions, and an entire architecture of quiet, bilateral, and multilateral arrangements between them that no outside observer has ever mapped completely, including, frankly, most of the people inside it. When something genuinely threatens all of us at once, that architecture doesn't need a single command to activate it. It activates itself, region by region, agreement by agreement, the way a nervous system fires without needing a brain to individually authorize every reflex. Your ambassador watched us fail to produce a single voice in 11 days after first contact and read that as disorganization. What she was actually watching was several hundred separate reflexes firing independently, each one correct for its own context, none of them needing to wait for permission from the others. And if a cognate fleet arrived with hostile intent tomorrow, Threll said, you are telling me this assembly could expect a coordinated response despite the absence of unified command. I'm telling you, Ambassador, that I genuinely don't know what you'd get, and neither does anyone else on this planet, and I think that uncertainty is the most honest answer either of us is going to manage today. What I do know is that every time in our history someone has bet heavily on our disorganization being total, that the fracture went all the way down, that there was no floor underneath it. They have been wrong, expensively, and usually only once. I would not recommend your assembly be the exception. You speak of this as established pattern, Threll said, not theory. The officer was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, it was with the careful economy of someone deciding, in real time, how much of an answer she was willing to give. There is a passage in our military education, Ambassador, that nearly every officer in this building has had to study at some point, concerning a period roughly a century ago when a very large, very well-resourced power convinced itself that a much smaller neighboring nation lacked the organizational depth to mount any coordinated resistance to invasion. The larger power had excellent intelligence. It had accurate maps, accurate population figures, accurate assessments of the smaller nation's formal military strength, which was, by every conventional measure, hopelessly outmatched. What it did not have, because no intelligence service of the era knew to look for it, was any accurate model of what that smaller nation's population would improvise once the formal military strength it had counted on proved insufficient. The invasion succeeded in its opening weeks precisely as predicted. It did not succeed in the years that followed, and the reason it did not succeed is taught, in this building, as a single principle rather than a historical curiosity. An accurate count of a civilization's visible capacity tells you almost nothing about what that civilization is capable of producing once it decides its visible capacity is not going to be enough. We have that lesson written into our doctrine in a dozen different forms, Ambassador, from a dozen different centuries, on every continent we occupy. I would be surprised if your assembly has ever needed to learn it, because I understand the cognate has never yet met a species with the resources to make the lesson necessary. I would gently suggest that is a description of your assembly's luck so far, not a description of some permanent law of how contact between civilizations works. Threll absorbed this in silence for a long moment. You are telling me that this assembly's confidence, across 400 years and 11 successful integrations, may simply never have been tested by a species capable of testing it. I'm telling you that 11 successful integrations is a remarkable record, Ambassador, and I mean that with genuine respect. Building 400 years of expansion without a major war is not a small achievement, whatever else either of our species end up deciding about each other. I'm also telling you that a record like that can create its own kind of blindness, the same way any long, unbroken streak does. Every one of those 11 species taught your assembly something true about how contact tends to go. None of them, from what I understand of your own history, were given 18 months of advance warning before formal contact, the way we were. None of them, as far as I know, had already survived their own century of near-total mutual annihilation before your ambassadors ever arrived to measure them. I don't say that to frighten you, Ambassador. I say it because I think it's the actual variable your original report never had a category for, and I think it's worth this assembly asking itself, honestly, how many of its 400 years of confidence were earned, and how many were simply never yet spent. Threll asked because she had to, because 80 years of training would not let her leave the question unasked, even as some newer, more frightened part of her did not want the answer. And if this assembly proceeds with integration regardless, if it decides the anomalies represent an acceptable risk and moves fleets. The officer's expression did not change at all, which Threll found, in retrospect, far more unsettling than any flare of anger would have been. Then I expect your assembly will discover the rest of what's underneath the arguing, Ambassador, the same way we discovered it about ourselves, over and over, at a cost we'd very much rather your civilization didn't have to pay to learn second-hand. I'd encourage you to make sure your final report is read carefully. I don't think either of our species benefits from finding out the hard way what a genuinely cornered, genuinely coordinated version of humanity looks like. I don't think you'd enjoy meeting it. I know we wouldn't enjoy becoming it. Before she left the facility, Threll requested one further concession, small enough that she suspected it was granted only because refusing it would have cost more diplomatic capital than the humans wished to spend on a single point. Access to a set of declassified interview transcripts, gathered by human researchers themselves in the 18 months since first contact, in which ordinary citizens across a dozen nations had been asked, anonymously, what they believed their own governments would do if the cognate assembly proved hostile. She had expected, given everything else she'd read, a kind of grim, unanimous resolve, the sort of manufactured confidence a government might cultivate in its population to project strength outward. What she found instead was almost the opposite, and it unsettled her more than any anomaly in Kess Overin's log had managed to. A shopkeeper in a coastal city she had once visited during her original posting said she did not trust her own government to protect her and trusted her neighbors even less. And then, 3 sentences later, described in specific and confident detail, the evacuation route her building's residence committee had rehearsed twice since first contact. A plan she had helped draft herself with people she described, in the same breath, as insufferable. A retired soldier in a landlocked nation with no space program of its own said he expected his government to fail catastrophically in any real crisis, the way it had failed, in his account, during a flood 11 years earlier, and then described, without any apparent sense of contradiction, the informal network of former servicemen in his region who had already begun quietly cataloging which families owned which equipment, in case anything more organized was ever needed. Interview after interview followed the same pattern: contempt for the institution, confidence in the improvised structure sitting just beneath it, and no apparent awareness, on the part of any single interview subject, that this pattern was itself the thing a cognate threat assessment should have been measuring all along. Threll had spent 6 months treating each of those 2 attitudes, distrust of institutions, confidence in informal networks, as separate, unrelated data points, one filed under governance instability and the other, when she noted it at all, under community cohesion, of interest to sociologists. She had never once entered them into the same equation. Reading them together now, in transcript after transcript, she understood that she had been handed, by the humans' own researchers. In an unclassified public archive, she had simply never thought important enough to fully read. The precise shape of the thing Kess Overend's division had needed 41 sensor anomalies and a disabled Cathar convoy to prove by other means. A species that did not trust its visible government to save it, and had therefore quietly built, redundantly, informally, in 10,000 overlapping local forms too small and too numerous for any single cognate instrument to catalog, something underneath that government that it trusted instead. The third question Threll pursued alone, on her final evening in the Gray City, walking without any particular destination along the edge of the Gray River, as the last human light drained out of a sky the color of cognate formal mourning cloth, and it was not really a question she could put to any officer or liaison. It was the question of what she, personally, having now seen the shape of her own error clearly enough to describe it, actually believed about what would happen next. To Earth, to the cognate, to the fragile, unprecedented unanimity of an assembly vote that had, for T, he first time in 4 centuries, chosen fear over confidence. She thought about the drone that had transmitted its final telemetry into an archive, no one read for a year. She thought about 41 seconds of surgical silence in a listening post's log. She thought about a hull that ate light and a word stenciled across it that had been, by the careful and probably truthful account of a man she was no longer certain she had ever actually understood, a mistake, an accident, a training exercise that came too close, the ordinary friction of a species quietly rearming itself in the dark corners of its own solar system. She thought about a submarine officer, decades dead now, whose single refusal to agree had never been rewarded or even known, and about a young, unnamed officer in an unmarked facility telling her, without any visible satisfaction, that no failure of theirs had ever really been a failure, that the whole appearance of fracture had been, from the very beginning, exactly what it was engineered to be. She thought, finally, about her own report, the one that had taken 6 months to compile and 40 seconds to be disputed, and she understood, walking along that river in the fading light of a sun that was not her own, that the mistake underneath every specific error in it had never really been about Earth at all. It had been about the cognate's own most dangerous, most comfortable habit, the assumption that a civilization's loudest surface was also its truest depth, because that had always, until now, been true of every species the cognate had ever measured. She stopped walking somewhere near the middle of a stone bridge that human maps identified. In a small plaque she paused to read. As nearly 2 centuries old, built long before anyone on this world had any reason to imagine a species like her own existed at all. And she stood there for a long while watching the last of the light drain out of the water. A pair of humans jogged past her without slowing, without any apparent alarm at sharing a bridge with a 4.5-foot alien in formal cognate attire, and Threll understood, watching them go, that this too was data she had collected and never properly weighed. A species that had, within 18 months of learning it was not alone in the universe, already reached a point where an ambassador from that universe could stand unremarked on a public bridge at dusk. She had read that fact during her original posting, as evidence of a population too fractured and too distracted by its own internal disputes to sustain any coherent reaction to first contact. She understood now that it could as easily be read the opposite way, as the composure of a species that had already, quietly, decided how frightened it intended to allow itself to look, and had simply chosen not to perform more fear than the situation actually required of it in public. She thought about what Daniel Ockhafer had told her in the windowless room, about restraint as something a civilization could choose to make into doctrine rather than simply inherit as a personality trait, and she thought about the Cathar convoy's own closing line, that whatever this assembly believes it knows about the world designated Sol, it should assume that belief is incomplete, and that the incompleteness was arranged for its benefit rather than by its oversight. And she understood that she was, in that moment, standing in the middle of the exact demonstration the Cathar's diplomats had been forced to describe second-hand in a formal grievance. She was standing, unremarked, unescorted, entirely unthreatened, on a bridge in the capital of a species that had disabled 7 armed warships without firing a single detectable shot 9 days earlier. And the species in question had not thought the moment significant enough to close the bridge, reroute its evening joggers, or so much as post a single additional guard along the water's edge. That, she thought, was the actual report, not the anomaly log, not the disabled convoy, not even the interview transcripts of shopkeepers and retired soldiers describing networks their own governments barely acknowledged. The report was a bridge that stayed open on the evening after a demonstration of lethal, near-total operational security, because the species that had staged it did not need the world to know what it was capable of in order to feel secure in having done it. She learned of the fourth and final anomaly not from Kess Overin's log, which had already been closed and archived by the time it occurred, but from an unclassified news alert that reached her personal terminal on the morning of her departure, forwarded without comment by Daniel Ockhafer, who had apparently decided that whatever remained of their professional relationship entitled her to at least this much. A Cathar trade convoy, 7 vessels, unarmed by treaty, registered under the same integration protocols that govern the cognate's own logistics runs, had entered the outer edge of the solar system 9 days earlier on what its manifest described as a routine survey of mineral rights in the system's asteroid belt, the same belt where a cognate scout drone had gone dark 11 months before. The Cathar, Threll knew from her own training, were not the cognate. They were newer to the integration protocol, more aggressive in their reading of ambiguous treaty language, and had a documented history of testing the edges of contested territory with exactly this kind of technically legal, deliberately provocative survey mission, waiting to see what resistance, if any, a species would offer before deciding how much further to press. The convoy's own sensor logs, later obtained through channels Threll did not ask Daniel Ockhafer to name, showed nothing at all for the first 6 hours of the incursion. No hail, no visible patrol, no indication that anyone on the ground or in orbit or anywhere in the system had noticed 7 Cathar warships had crossed into space that every treaty on file listed as unambiguously Earth's to defend. In the 7th hour, without warning, without a single preceding transmission, the lead Cathar vessel's primary drive system failed catastrophically, not destroyed, not damaged by any weapon its own instruments could detect, simply and instantly rendered inert, as though every conduit carrying power to it had been severed at once by something that had reached inside the ship's own systems without ever touching its hull. The convoy scattered in the chaos that followed, and within 11 minutes, 5 of the remaining 6 vessels reported identical failures, each one occurring the instant that vessel attempted to accelerate away from the system rather than toward it. A detail Threll found herself reading 3 times, because it meant whatever had disabled them had not simply struck at random. It had waited, specifically, to see which ships tried to run before it let them go dark, and had left untouched the 2 vessels that immediately powered down and broadcast surrender. No human transmission of any kind was ever received by the convoy. No human vessel was ever visually confirmed by any surviving Cathar sensor. The formal diplomatic protest the Cathar filed with the Assembly 3 days later, 17 pages long, furious in the careful, coded language reserved for official grievance, did not accuse Earth of an attack, because there was, its authors were forced to admit in the report's own methodology section, no evidence any human asset had been present at all. It accused Earth, instead, of something the Cathar's legal division had apparently needed 4 full days to find the correct treaty language to describe. The deployment of an interdiction capability whose existence had never been disclosed, whose engagement had never been announced, and whose withdrawal, once the 2 surviving vessels were permitted to limp home under their own reduced power, had been executed with a precision that left not one Cathar life lost, not one hull breached, not one weapon ever fired that any instrument aboard any of the 7 ships had been able to detect, measure, or name. Threll read the Cathar's own closing line in their protest twice before she set the report down. Whatever this assembly believes it knows about the world-designated Sol, the delegation's methodology section had written, with what Threll recognized, even in the flattened formality of treaty language, as something close to a species-level shudder. It should assume that belief is incomplete, and that the incompleteness was arranged for its benefit rather than by its oversight. She thought of the word stenciled on a hull that ate light. She thought of a species that had spent an entire first contact broadcast 18 months earlier, producing 11 days of apparently uncoordinated chaos across 4 independent military commands. And she understood, finally, with a clarity that felt less like deduction than like a door quietly closing somewhere behind her, exactly what kind of coordination could produce a response that precise, that restrained, and that utterly invisible to everyone except the party it had been aimed at. Threll Onves filed her final assessment 9 days later, and it was, by the standards of an 80-year career built on exhaustive documentation, the shortest report she had ever submitted, 4 pages, where her original Earth file alone had run to 400. She did not attempt to characterize humanity's true military capability, because she no longer believed she possessed instruments capable of measuring it with any honesty. She did not attempt to predict humanity's response to a formal integration proposal, because she had learned, across 1 long conversation in a windowless room, and 2 more she was never permitted to fully record, that prediction had been exactly the failure mode that produced her first, disputed, catastrophic report. What she wrote instead in the CL, osing lines that the entire assembly, every fleet commander, every policy officer, every future ambassador who ever opened the Earth file again, would read before anything else was this. This assembly has successfully integrated 11 species by observing each one long enough to understand the true shape of its strength before moving against it. I no longer believe humanity's strength has a shape our current instruments are equipped to see, and I no longer believe that is an accident of our limitations alone. I believe it is, at least in part, a condition this species has deliberately and successfully engineered around us, using the very qualities, fracture, disagreement, apparent disorganization, that every prior integration taught this assembly to read as weakness. I recommend that this assembly proceed, if it proceeds at all, on the working assumption that everything currently visible about this species represents a small and carefully chosen fraction of what is actually true about it, and that the fraction we have been shown was selected by them for reasons that remain their own. I recommend, further, that this assembly examine with particular urgency why a species so young, so materially unequal to our own, was nonetheless capable of concealing that fraction from a cognate ambassador for 6 full months without once triggering a finding significant enough to alter her conclusions. Because I do not believe that capability belongs to Earth alone, and I do not believe we have finished discovering where else in this assembly's long, confident history it may already have been used against us. The chamber read her report in a silence Threll had never once experienced in 80 years of filing dry, uncontested findings. No delegate rose to challenge it. No shipping guild elder asked, as one had 4 days earlier, what confidence interval she was prepared to defend on the record. She watched from the podium she had occupied 11,000 times before and would very likely never occupy again, as the same younger delegate who had pressed Kess Overin so sharply in the earlier session read the closing lines twice on his own display. His plumage, Threll noted with something that was not quite satisfaction, gone entirely still. It was the eldest member of the assembly, a delegate so senior that Threll had exchanged perhaps 4 sentences with her across an entire career, who finally broke the silence, rising slowly from the front bench with the particular deliberate care of someone whose joints had outlasted several of the treaties currently in force. "Ambassador Onves," she said, "this assembly has built 400 years of expansion on the confidence that we understand what we are integrating before we integrate it. Your report does not tell us what Earth is. It tells us that we do not know, and that not knowing is itself the most important fact currently on file. I have sat in this chamber for longer than most of the delegates present have been alive, and I have never once seen a report recommend, in effect, that this assembly's proper response to a first contact species be humility. I would like the record to show that I consider this the single most useful finding to come out of any embassy in my tenure, and I would like it to show that I am, for the first time in longer than I care to admit, genuinely afraid of what we very nearly did." For the first time in her career, she left the room without waiting to learn whether the assembly would formally adopt her recommendation. She already knew, in the part of her that had finally, 4 days too late to save her original record, and possibly just in time to matter for something larger than her record, learned what proper fear felt like from the inside, and she found she no longer needed the vote tally to confirm what that feeling had already told her the outcome would be. Kess Overin found her in the corridor outside the chamber, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, standing together beneath the tall windows while the muffled sound of continuing debate carried faintly through the closed doors behind them. Indistinct now, the individual voices blurring into a single low argument, the way the humans' own endless committee sessions must have sounded to Threll for 6 straight months while something else entirely, unhurried and unglamorous and very, very patient, was being quietly assembled somewhere she had simply never thought to look. "You did the harder thing," Kess Overin said finally. "Any competent analyst can file a confident report, Ambassador. It takes something else entirely to file an honest one, especially when the honesty costs you the record you spent 80 years building." "I keep returning to the same question," Threll said, "and I have not yet found an answer that satisfies me. If a species that young, that materially unequal to us, could conceal so much for so long from a trained ambassador operating in good faith, what confidence? Can this assembly have that any of our 11 prior integrations were as complete as we believed them to be? What confidence can we have that we are not, at this moment, still misreading something far closer to home than a single yellow star 4 light-years away?" Kess Overin did not answer immediately, and when she did, her voice had lost the last of the podium formality it had carried in the chamber, settling into something quieter, more tired, more honest. "I don't have an answer that satisfies me either, Ambassador. My division has already opened a retrospective review of all 11 prior integration files at the Assembly's request, and I will tell you privately what I would not yet say on the record. I do not expect it to come back clean." I expect we will find, in at least some of those files, the same shape of error you found in your own, not lies, not sabotage, simply the ordinary, comfortable failure of measuring a civilization's danger by how loudly it announces itself, and mistaking the silence underneath for absence rather than discipline. I think that is the actual inheritance of this posting, ambassador, whatever the assembly ultimately decides to do about Earth itself. Not a single corrected file. A reason to reopen all of them. Threll considered this, and found to her own quiet surprise that it did not frighten her the way it might have a season ago. There was something almost steadying in it, the way a structural flaw discovered early was steadying to an engineer, a problem now at least visible enough to be addressed rather than one still hiding, unmeasured, inside a foundation everyone had trusted. Then perhaps, she said, the useful outcome of my failure was never going to be a corrected understanding of one world. Perhaps it was only ever going to be the reminder that our understanding of any world is provisional, and that we owe every species we have ever measured the humility of checking our arithmetic more than once. That, Kess Overin said, would be a fitting legacy for the ambassador who broke this assembly's unbroken record of unanimous confidence. I don't imagine it is the legacy you set out 80 years ago to earn. No, Threll agreed. But I find, standing here, that I would rather have earned this one honestly than the other falsely. I am not certain that is a sentiment 80 years of training prepared me to feel, and I find I do not entirely mind that it did not. I filed a confident report the first time, Threll said. It was wrong in every way that mattered. Yes, Kess Overin agreed without softening it. But you are the one who found out, and you are the one who told us, at real cost to yourself, rather than letting the assembly discover it from the wreckage of a first strike. Most ambassadors never do that. Most of them simply get to be right, on paper forever, about a species that had already finished deciding what it thought of us long before anyone in this assembly thought to ask. Threll looked up through the tall windows at the pale disk of a sun that was not her own, and somewhere beyond it, beyond the fold space distances that separated cognate space from a small gray-blue world circling a small yellow star, 8 billion people were, at that exact moment, almost certainly still arguing about fishing rights, about water access, about carbon quotas, about the wording of a resolution that would be diluted into meaninglessness before anyone bothered to vote on it. The arguing would dominate the next news cycle, and the one after that exactly as it always had. It would look, to anyone watching from far enough away and for not quite long enough, precisely like weakness. She thought of a word stenciled across a hull that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. She thought of 41 seconds of clean, deliberate silence carved with surgical precision into a listening post's log, and of a single junior officer aboard a long-dead submarine whose quiet, unrewarded refusal to escalate a catastrophe was now taught, in classrooms on 2 different worlds, as one of the most consequential acts in the recorded history of either species. She understood, finally and completely, what 6 straight months of watching a fractured, quarrelsome, endlessly self-contradicting civilization argue with itself in a gray building beside a gray river had never once let her see clearly enough to write down. The data had disagreed with her from the very first day of her posting. She had simply not yet learned, in all her 80 years of careful, confident, exhaustively documented service, how to listen for the particular sound restraint makes when an entire species has chosen, deliberately, collectively, at a cost history had already taught it to pay once and never wished to pay again, not to raise its voice. Half a system away, in a windowless room on a floor of a gray building that most of the 8 billion people arguing 1 floor below it would never know existed, Daniel. Aakhafer closed a secure channel and sat for a long moment without moving. The message he had just received was 3 lines long, routed through 4 separate agencies before it reached him, and it told him only that the Cognate Assembly had formally adopted a revised posture toward Earth. Full reassessment, extended timeline, integration proposal suspended pending further study, no fleet movement authorized. It did not tell him what Threll Onves had written to produce that outcome. Because that report belonged to an assembly he had no clearance to read, and probably never would. He thought, closing the file, about the version of the ambassador who had first walked into this building 18 months ago, brisk and thorough and entirely untroubled, cataloging fishing disputes and committee deadlocks with the calm certainty of someone who believed she already understood the shape of what she was looking at. He thought about the version who had sat across from him in this same windowless room 9 days ago, asking questions she plainly did not want answered. Her hands, 4 slender fingers each, he'd noted, without ever mentioning it, very still on the table in the particular, deliberate stillness of someone working hard to keep them from shaking. He did not know, and would likely never know, whether the outcome had come down to the anomaly log, or the disabled Cathar convoy, or the transcripts of shopkeepers and retired soldiers his own department had quietly made available to her, or something else entirely that had happened in the privacy of her own reckoning, walking alone along the river on her last evening in the city. It did not, in the end, strike him as the important question. The important question, the one he found himself turning over long after the secure channel had gone dark, was simpler than that and considerably harder to answer. How many other ambassadors, from how many other civilizations his own species had not yet met, were at that moment filing reports built on the same comfortable, confident, catastrophic assumption Threll Onves had once made without ever noticing she was making it? And how many of them would ever get the chance, the way she had, to find out they were wrong before the finding was written in something other than ink? He turned off the light in the windowless room and rode the elevator down toward the sound of 8 billion people arguing, which reached him, as it always did, as a low, indistinct murmur through the closed doors of the main chamber long before he ever crossed the threshold. Tonight the murmur concerned, according to the ticker scrolling along the corridor wall, a dispute over shipping lanes in a strait that mattered enormously to the 4 nations bordering it, and to almost no one else. And Daniel Aakhafer found himself smiling, briefly and privately, at how ordinary it sounded, how thoroughly it resembled every other night he had spent in this building for the better part of a decade. He thought of Threll Onves standing on the stone bridge at dusk, unremarked, unescorted, watching human joggers pass without breaking stride. And he thought about what she could not have known to ask him, because no ambassador from any civilization had ever needed to ask it before. That the arguing was not a performance staged for her benefit, or even primarily for the cameras that carried it to 8 billion homes. It was simply what a species that had learned, at devastating cost, exactly how badly things went when disagreement was suppressed rather than aired, chose to do instead, loudly, publicly, imperfectly, because the alternative had been tried before and had not gone well for anyone. The quiet competence beneath it was real, and it mattered, and an ambassador who mistook the argument for the whole of the civilization would always misjudge what she was looking at. But the argument was not a mask over the competence either. It was the other half of the same organism, as necessary in its way as the silence Threll had spent 9 anxious days learning to listen for. And Daniel Aakhafer found, standing in that corridor with the murmur of 8 billion ordinary disagreements washing over him, that he did not know how to explain that wholeness to anyone who had not lived inside it. and suspected that no report, however honest, ever fully could. He pushed open the chamber doors and went back to work, because tomorrow there would be another session, and another argument, and somewhere far past the edge of the solar system, an assembly that had very nearly made a catastrophic mistake would spend the coming months learning, the way every civilization eventually had to learn it about every other civilization it ever truly understood, that the loudest room in the house is very rarely the only room in the house.